Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics, the show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Grab a glass of whatever and join us as we dive deep into the bizarre origins, surprising mechanics, and the tiny fine print of games you know or may never have heard of. I'm your host, Troy, and joining me is my co-host, Max. Working behind the scenes to deliver this episode is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is about a classic. We're going back to 1968 to take a look at Charles Grant's Battle, the origin of British World War II gaming.
Yeah, so, Troy, we had a hell of a time reading this one.
It's really interesting how it split across 2 years of a magazine instead of being initially released as a book.
There is a book of it, but we were not able to find a PDF or in-print copy of it that was easily available. So, to all of you out there that have this game, keep it safe. This game was created by Charles Grant, who was born in Scotland and served in the Royal Air Force in World War II. Should give you some hint to where this game is going. And later served in Scotland Yard's Special Branch and contributed to military modeling and battle magazines. This game is published in, of all things, Meccano Magazine originally. Does everybody remember Meccano? It's like little metal plates that have holes drilled into them, and then you can like bend and fold them and rivet them together and then make little motors. So in the pages of this magazine, between 1968 and 1970, roughly speaking, May of 1968 to December 1970, are essentially the foundational principles of something that had been worked out for a while in the UK in the basements and back garages. What do they call them? Sheds in the UK. And the game was made primarily between Charles and his son, who are basically the primary developers and playtesters, though they clearly are connected to this broader community, which is mentioned. And it's published in magazine form. And this game is sort of the, as far as I can tell, it's kind of the seminal influence for most British wargaming. I'm sure it has other influences, and I'm sure we'll get into exploring some of those. But we can immediately tell that it had a direct influence on some of the staff and writers behind Games Workshop, Warlord Games, and the very special Too Fat Lardies games. It's written in a incredibly educated British style, where it is both deferent and apologetic, a little bit pedantic at times, though some of that is just repeating the concepts because it is in periodical form. So if you can imagine the sections in a rule book, and every month you get another section. And it became the sort of, I guess, as far as we understand miniature gaming today, some part of it lies here in this game. So without further ado to that bit of a scattered intro, Troy, maybe you can kind of set us up with, like, what is the meat of this game?
So Battle is a World War II battle game. It is inherently a skirmish title that includes enough additional mechanics as to really elevate it to that battle perspective. This is a game where you're going to be playing with individually singular base models. And to get you in the mood for this title, there's a dramatic narrative at the start that includes a description of an attack by some soldiers on a defended position. And the situation quickly deteriorates. And then the game famously asks, what would you do? And that is the way that you get your head into the space of where Charles Grant wants you to be. He then gives a really good introduction to the base concept of wargaming as a whole. As Max pointed out, this was in Meccano Magazine. This was not in a dedicated wargaming book, magazine, periodical. This was appearing almost in someone else's hobby space because we didn't have our own at the time. So you had to really lay down what this was about at a very fundamental level. So that was covered in the description of wargaming, why you do it, where people have gone with it in the past. And then we discuss what we're going to do with the models, the arguably most important part of the tabletop experience. At this point in history, we're looking at 1/72nd, 20mm, and 25mm models. They're available in plastic, if you might be surprised by that, but there was Airfix available in plastic, so you could definitely get models that were single pose, but they were available in the letter plastic material as opposed to letter pewter. Then you'd be able to get tanks that you would build from modeling kits. These would be not necessarily made exclusively for game purposes, like you find with a lot of the models that you would have today, but this would be a minifigs kit and building that.
And you could imagine that these armies would be a little mismatched. He does give recommendations for a range of sizes that you could use, and he does make a point about how you're just going to have to use your imagination because they might not match up exactly.
And the models themselves are all prescribed to be individually based. So you don't want to have section or team level basing. This game is a little different than some of the Napoleonic counterparts of the era, where you may have 3 to 4 models mounted on a base. This is one rifleman or gunner of some type on their own base.
Right, yeah. And I mean, if you're from Napoleonics, that might seem like a bit of a novel concept, but it does make sense as we progress. So the next thing to talk about, which is, I think is one of the more interesting sections, because I don't know that I've ever seen this in another game book, is Grant makes a really good justification for exactly what the distance moved is. And the best way, like he explains roughly how he comes to this based on the scale of the table, but the measurements that he puts down are based in a movement factor where 1 inch equates to 1 mile per hour. But so, okay, let me sort of explain that. That wouldn't be you travel 1 mile with 1 inch. It would be that is the rate of movement overall.
Oh, okay.
So can't remember exactly. What was it, like 300 yards or something like that to the scale of the actual inch? I can't remember exactly what it was. But yeah, he gives a really good justification for the exact speed. So what he basically says is that a person walks, he gives a very generous 3 mile an hour walking, or well, I guess you could call it moving with purpose. My own calculations sort of see that the brisk walk is usually about 2 miles an hour. But if you were on a battlefield, I could make a full justification for 3. There's it's not an intricate breakdown, but it is a good justification for why the movement is the speed that it is. And for other war games that I've played, it seems short, but then we're kind of thinking about the scale of the models being uneven. So there's a certain amount of squidginess that you can kind of get away with.
Yeah, there certainly is. And the vehicles move a lot further on road than they do off road and going on country. And the main difference with that is you have to calculate the miles per hour on a road per the amount of move you make, and then how much move you have left. How would that be calculated off-road? So it can be a bit squidgy indeed, but it is actually really cool because if you don't have the stats for a vehicle and you want to be able to put it in the game, you just need to know the miles per hour, which is generally available.
I don't know if it's intentional or not, but there are certain nods to game ability, like sort of simplifying or rounding things so that you're not being scientifically accurate in every situation, just for the simplicity of play.
That's true.
But that isn't always present, as we will find when we go through that. Sometimes it gets very specific, and sometimes it's just very simple. So moving on to the dice, we're using D6 dice, which is pretty common for a lot of tabletop war games that at least take inspiration from this. Maybe overall, Troy, you're a bit more of the war game aficionado between us, so...
The famous sentiment is that if you use dice other than D6s, people won't play it. And that's sort of true in some effects. I mean, I've played brilliant games using non-D6s, but it is a harder sell because people might not have a whole bunch of D8s or D12s lying around.
Well, and in this era, it may just be a matter of these are the dice, because this is predating... I mean, there may be odd dice somewhere.
That's right.
But this is before the business ingenuity of Luzacci. So the ubiquity of polyhedral dice is not obvious. And in fact, the only other dice that he mentions are poker dice. And he says those are not to be used for what I would assume are obvious reasons.
It is.
People don't know what poker dice are. We might do an episode on that because that's actually a really fascinating game. But moving on, he makes a good justification for randomness existing. And I think this is important to set out at this era of gaming, because older games that are used by the military adopted dice. So later forms of Kriegspiel, which is, I guess, the great-grandfather of all wargaming.
Mm-hmm.
It does use dice, but it uses them in a very sparing way, whereby within certain eras and certain doctrines of Kriegspiel, basically people with actual military experience, because it's a military exercise, basically just make up the results out of their head and pretend to roll. It's the ghost roll.
Yes.
It's the invention of the ghost roll. If people don't know what ghost rolling is, that's when you roll dice, but it actually doesn't mean anything. It's just theater. The D6s in this case are exclusively, with a couple exceptions, for resolving combat interactions, shooting primarily.
Shooting and the effect on that target that you shot at, right?
Generally, yeah. So the accuracy of the hitting, particularly with anti-armor and artillery, and the effect, which applies broadly overall. And the basic mechanics or the variables in those rolls are defensive and strike values. There's a lot of different ways that that's played out in other war games, but this is where this game quantifies combat force. Troy, maybe we can so we've determined the scale of movement, but can you give us something a little bit more of like the movement rules themselves?
The movement rules are quite simple in that it's really tracking if you're in rough ground, open ground, or on a road. Those are mainly what you need to know. The vehicles have very different speeds on road. They can move 15, 19 inches, and then you put a wheeled vehicle off-road, they're moving a maximum of 4. So that really slows things down.
Right.
When you're looking at infantry movement, it's funny because this author is playing on a truly gigantic table, but gives us very reserved infantry movement rates.
Oh, yes. We have to talk about the table.
The table is a massive... What is the measurement again?
It's 9 by 7 feet.
Wow.
I can't reach across... Like, it's a strain to reach further than 4 feet for most people. I consider myself pretty average height. So if you're not using prods to move units, and these are single base units.
Yes.
I'm not exactly sure how this was pulled off, but he seems... I don't know if he's proud of it. And there's a photo in the magazine article, and I strongly suspect this is actually several tables put together, though I can't be 100% sure of that. But he does mention some scenarios which are used as examples that take place on much smaller tables.
That's right.
That seem to share, how would I say, relative proportions, so that you could think of it as, yeah, it's a 9 by 7 table, but it might actually be 3 tables. Yeah, I was just sort of like, oh yeah, you may not have a table as big as mine. I'm like, I don't think a lot of people have a table that big.
Yeah.
I don't know. Where are you keeping this?
100%. You have to have a drawing room specifically for massive war games in your British house.
Yeah, no, I that part made me sort of stop and think about it. I actually had to pull out a tape measure and be like, wait, how big is that? That like fills my living room.
Yeah, that's a crazy one. So that's an interesting concession, but the time scale and distance is accounted for using the miles per hour. And then the movement rates are converted to inches, and infantry is given, like we indicated earlier, that 3 miles per hour kind of base approximation. And then when everything is divided down to its inches, you quickly see you need a vehicle to get anywhere. Infantry can move about a farm complex or around a wooded copse, but to get them there from your starting line, that's going to take a half track or a truck or something, just because of the conservative movement rates of troops.
Yeah, it's definitely deployment based. I think that's like, you could march guys in from the edge of the map and just work from that, but it would take a very long time. And as soon as a vehicle was able to get up to them, it would probably hold them out in the open, and you wouldn't want that. So there is a tactical reason to transport troops in this game, which is neat.
Yeah, and that's something that kind of plays with the scale of the game, where you're using a number of models that might feel like a skirmish, but this game suggests a larger battle. It does that, in the need for transport. As most skirmish games, you don't really need to think about that. But in this title, it does encourage it.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess we can start defining the different aspects of the game, those being, at least as far as units go, infantry, armor, which he kind of invariably combines with anti-tank. So I suppose field guns kind of fit into that. And artillery, which is like bombardment weapons. He definitely has a concession to all of these things in the way that he describes them. But we'll start with infantry. Oh yeah, the point that I was going to make was that the way these articles are written, it's not written in, how would I say? It's not written the way that a game manual would be written.
Right.
It's you're getting things before other things, which make more sense as you go. I mean, the section about using dice is kind of just an explanation. And then later on, they start integrating those mechanics. Like one of the last things that comes out, which is a huge game changer, is the morale system and terrain effects. You really got to you got to make sure you have a good subscription to Meccano Magazine.
Yeah.
Unless later on you end up buying the book. But yeah. So anyway, Troy, let's go through the infantryman's weapon kit and all of the options enclosed in that.
So with your infantry weapons, you have your small arms first. This accounts for rifles and submachine guns, but the light machine gun of World War II is not present. It is not defined as an individual weapon, but is instead considered to be covered and subsumed into the output of the rifleman of a section.
And what did you think of that?
That bugs the heck out of me. I kind of hate it. I hate it so much because the LMG was the key squad weapon in World War II and late World War I combat, to the point that it defined how platoon level combat happened. So to just simplify it away, I can see reasons for it because it does necessitate you having a special figure who you track and monitor. And for the Napoleonic titles in popularity that would have preceded this game, you would not have had that. You would have had a company of riflemen, and they would have all been individually based, sure, but they all would have been interchangeable.
Yeah.
And this game keeps that sentiment in a capacity because there's no LMG. And the SMG is effectively the same thing as a rifle, just with different ranges.
And you would have to track that, which is usually on a junior leader of some kind or some subordinate from a senior command. So it's not as though you don't have to track that, but you're right. And it's not as though he doesn't know that they exist, because later on in one of the articles, he mentions the outfit of a British section, which would be your sort of rifle unit, like the rifle section. And he mentions that it's 8 men with rifles, a officer with a submachine gun, and a Bren gun, which is a big bipoded light machine gun.
Yeah, that's right.
So I don't know why it doesn't happen. I mean, we don't have to say any more on it, except for the fact that I'm confused by its absence, aside from, I guess, what you were saying.
Yeah, that's all I got for that. But how you resolve the shooting is by dice pool for your infantry. You have your range bands that you determine, so close, medium, or extreme ranges. The range bands are quite short. So even though, again, this is a large table, as we've discussed, you're having to get pretty up and close and pretty friendly with someone before you're able to actually open fire on them. And that is up to 9 inches for a submachine gun. So that's really quite close. And it's based on a ground scale where there's about, if I understand correctly, 30-ish yards to an inch. So the men and the ground scale don't directly align based on the figure scale we discussed. So it is actually not an incorrect range for an SMG. You just have to remember that your dude is way taller than the actual representation of a guy in the battle, as it were.
Yeah, that's right. I think I misspoke when I gave the range, but I think it's 30 yards.
But yeah, that's my understanding. And that would be sort of how that works. And then when you're determining your target, they're either going to be in open cover, so no cover, soft cover, or hard cover. Soft cover being defined as something that obstructs visibility to you, like foliage or hedgery, stuff like that. But hardcover would be the stone barn house in Normandy, for example, or the ruined building in Berlin. And that would be your hardcover.
Yeah. And so those are measured in an array where you have the dice value for the range written on one side and the cover type written across the top. And then you see what the effect is at each of those ranges. Exactly.
It's quite a straightforward way to handle it. And it's something that you're going to see repeated across following historical games, ad nauseum. People are going to use this pattern and this system going forward for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's it's nice to see that level of layout, especially if I'm thinking back when we were reading Tunnels and Trolls and I'm like, oh, could we have a table?
Yeah, 100%.
Where you write out all these things. I know there are some tables in that, but this was nice enough to have very clearly written, well spaced, even for a magazine, tables and charts, shorthands for different things. It's a well-considered game. He is a good game designer, if only by the delivery and formatting of the work.
Yeah. You know what? That's a good read for sure.
Yeah. I mean, and that matters.
It does.
Yeah. Then we jump straight into machine guns.
Right. So that's where we do get automatic weapons. We don't get the squad automatic, but we do get it in its conceptual sort of more like an artillery piece, if you pardon the term, as an actual like emplacement. And this thing projects out a cone of fire.
Not a huge one, but one worth noting. And I'm not really sure, like one area that I wasn't able to quite grasp was, at least in how he was writing, is because it's man to man, is it just whatever lands within that cone? Was that me understanding that? So that like you're not hitting the unit, like the section or the team, but you're hitting those guys that fall into this.
Exactly. And it allows you to hit people from different sections, different teams together. It creates a beaten zone as opposed to targeting a specific unit and only doing damage to them.
And then, of course, logically, because we're talking about a much heavier gun that's being operated by an entire team, you cannot move and shoot in the same round. So the thing has to set itself up in place, and it's in some ways a defensive weapon, or at least a preemptive weapon, where you put it where you want to control, and it is very effective at that. It has considerably longer ranges than rifles do.
Yes, that's where you actually can affect something at a decent range.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if I would call it like the workhorse of this, but it definitely helps you hold ground, as it does in other games, like in Too Fat Lardy's Chain of Command. It functions similarly. And I think in other World War II games, most designers represent heavier machine gun emplacements to be kind of a way to secure and project power into the battlefield.
100%. And once you get through your machine gun section, you're into more of a dedicated section on the small arms again of the submachine gun, which isn't that distinct from rifles other than range band and who has it. There's mention of where you can get good SMG models. They talk about that for the forces. And Charles Grant is using a mix of different manufacturers to build his collection here. So he kind of gives you tips from what he found in his era on where to get the goods.
Yeah, actually, a lot of that section is how do you get this on table, and not so much about how it actually functions.
It's true.
And there's actually going into the next thing. So we have anti-tank infantry weapons. I guess nowadays we would call them rocket-propelled grenades. And even in that section, or that part of the same section, I should say, he talks about his Russian troops not having an equivalent. So he took a rifle with the right pose, cut it off, and then glued on a piece of insulated wire, if I'm correct, which basically makes it look like a tube.
And then he's got a bazooka. Yep.
And now he has a bazooka, which is actually, if you know anything about Russian forces, the only rocket launchers they had were the ones that they took off Germans.
That's right. Yeah, the captured Panzerfaust. But they had their anti-tank rifles, sure, but those weren't the same thing.
Now, in all fairness, this does tie back to a thing that we didn't mention, which is sort of mentioned a few times through the rules, which is you don't have to play historically. He even talks about someone he knows who basically made up his own country and then gave it its own construction based on a sort of hodgepodge of British, German, Russian, whatever he felt like, because it was probably easier to assemble that. I think there's a lot of leeway for the fact that it's hard to get models at this time that fit what you want.
Take some ingenuity.
And if you want to have a situation where you can use infantry to stop a tank, well, then you might have to make your own rocket launcher. The RPGs attack in a similar way to the way that anti-tank weapons on tanks do. So we'll wait to get to that later. But yeah, we can jump on to the last of these direct, I guess, sort of specialized weapons, which is flamethrowers.
And the flamethrower is another area of effect weapon. It's quite powerful, as World War II games typically tend to say. The flamethrower was devastating, which I don't disagree with. And it also is very limited in its application in that it only has 3 squirts as they're defined by the author. And that would be something that you could target against vehicles. It pretty much is a guaranteed out of action on a soft skin. On infantry, it is very likely to take them out as well. And on armored vehicles, it can, but it's much more likely to impede them than it is to outright, destroy the vehicle.
Yeah. And there's some sense to that, though historically they can be pretty devastating to a heavy vehicle with its ventilation and its engine. So
yeah, exactly.
But I think some of that's for game balance, hence the 3 squirts rule. And then from there, we go into hand grenades and mortars. So there's some interesting points about, so maybe I'll get into the grenade thing. It's interesting because when I thought about the scale, it's a lot shorter than I'm used to with the other games that I play. And as you say, with the movement and the firing within like 9 inches with an SMG. But like the grenade's damage radius is 1 inch diameter, which is pretty small.
Yeah, it is. I thought it was like a 1 inch radius. I thought I misread it, but nope. It's actually just a single little inch circle, little 25 millimeter little circle.
Yeah. And there's even a template for like including the safe area so that you can kind of put that over where you want to hit and see if your own guy is within it.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I guess that's helpful. I've seen better hand grenade rules. But for a first attempt, this makes sense, like from base principles. Grenades work. He even mentions that like if your soldier is on one side of a wall and they throw the grenade over the wall, they probably don't have to worry about the effect, even if it's right next to them. Yeah, there's good justification for that. And if you think about the blast radius of an actual grenade is a little bit hard to calculate. So you either have to be dramatic or, in this case, very reserved.
Yes, I agree. And then mortars come in to represent probably, aside from the machine gun, the other most important infantry weapon. They have ranges that have a starting point of 6 inches, so pretty close to you, but they go out to 50 inches, which is one of the longer range weapons at any infantry can carry. And they do have relatively elaborate targeting rules for both establishing your target by rolling a ranging shot, which hits on a 5 or 6, and then followed by more consistent shots on the same target, hitting on a 3 or higher, but you need your ranging shot to first land. And that is not too bad, but sometimes if you want to do mortars that are off table, you're also going to need to incorporate radio communication, which we'll talk about later. But it does make the process sort of a 2-stage, establishing communications, establishing a ranging shot, then proceeding with your mortar bombardment.
The damage acts as a grenade, essentially, at least in the sense that it's radial. It can be a bit more effective, but I think that if I'm correct, the rule was basically the same.
It's pretty much exactly the same. And later he talks about, since grenades' trajectory is just up and down, they are a circular blast template as opposed to being a directional blast template as indicating a trajectory or arc of fire.
Right, yeah. So fairly simple to use, measure to the target. And then he makes need of a directional template that determines where it might misland, like where the misaiming might actually happen. I mean, in a lot of games that you and I have played, that is sort of done intuitively, but it works the same way. You draw a line to the target, and then it's either going to be you roll a die, and then that'll determine whether it's left, right, further back, or closer, or dead on, obviously.
After that, we are into the organization that he proposes / kind of leaves you on your own with a little bit, but it would be up to you to do your own research or to make up something that's satisfying to you. But he does, as Max indicated earlier, outline an infantry section or a rifle section from the Brits, which would be the 8 rifles, 1 leader with an SMG, and then no Bren gun. I mean, a Bren gun, but no Bren gun.
It doesn't factor into the rules.
That's right. So it's interesting, and it's something that this game plays with where it doesn't accurately represent down to the 1-to-1 scale the formations that you're playing with, but it does still kind of encourage you to play with a squad or a section, but then everything above that is abstracted, but everything at the section level is more or less an accurate representation of what that squad would have been. So it's interesting. There are choices being made to give you more of an elastic perspective of the tactical scope of World War II combat, not just only platoon level or only company or battalion. This is trying to catch them all, as it were, in its styling while still mainly focusing on the man-to-man combat.
It's a little, I don't want to say it's all over the place. Mostly that it just basically says do whatever you want. You don't have to have specific models or units that fit that.
And next, we're going to look at the HQs that are defined in this game. First is a platoon HQ with a classic British 2-inch mortar, which was a platoon-level support weapon, which did have an offensive sense in that it would fire, small charges. But more importantly is it would fire smoke bombs, and that would allow you to obscure the target in front of you. So this game does give you simplified rules for both. And the platoon HQ also is described as having a PIAT, projected infantry anti-tank launcher. That was the equivalent to the bazooka for the British. And this game sort of assigns them in a weird way that there's more than there actually historically were. But then it's kind of important that the infantry have a way to fight against the vehicles that we're about to get into talking about. So that's what you get at your platoon HQ. And then this game jumps to the company HQ, which is actually a battalion HQ. And it kind of merges the concept of the two of them. So there's a company that is both in charge of all the other groups, but isn't itself a group. And that has a mortar section of 4 mortars, including a forward observer. So that's a character that on their own goes forward and spots for your mortars, calling them back through the sequence we discussed earlier. You'll also have an anti-tank gun section with half-track prime movers to tow your guns. And those could be anything from a 2-pounder to a 6-pounder for the British, or a 50 millimeter from the Germans, or all the way up to an 88 if you're crazy. But that would be effectively what's included in the company HQ. And then you're followed by 2 more different sections. A heavy machine gun section with trucks or half-tracks, which is a very standard bit of kit for a battalion HQ. And then an assault pioneer or engineer section. And these guys, they're the ones that can lay mines, clear mines. They're the ones that have the flamethrower we talked about.
Yeah, it's your special force.
Exactly. You only really get, according to Charles Grant's organization, 6 to 8 figures in your assault pioneer section, but they're very important for what they do. Then to summarize your infantry combat, there is a section of this periodical called the Action at Twin Farms. This is an after-action report demonstration of the game rules. So it's black versus red forces, which are standing in for German and Russian forces from World War II, and he's just using the appropriate models for each, including the conversions we've talked about. And it details a reconnaissance in force against a prepared position, a farmhouse occupied by the Germans, and these sub-platoon level forces go in, but they're meant to represent an entire company. So it's only 3 half-tracks and enough troopers to fill that from the red 4 that's approaching black 4. But it is projected to be more than that, even though you're only using those parts. And then the play itself in this after-action report revolves around an ambush on these half-tracks by a Panzerfaust team of 2. So they're hiding behind a low stone wall. They're not visible. So when the lead half-track crosses the stone wall, the black 4 player declares, I actually have a Panzerfaust right here, and he's within 6 inches and will take his shot. And that Panzerfaust is able to knock out the leading half-track, and then chaos ensues. So it's a great battle. It ends inconclusively, and what it suggests is that reinforcements or some change in the scenario would now be needed to keep the player's interest and maintain the momentum of the scenario.
My general feeling around these examples was that they were, I guess, a little tedious to read.
It did.
But also probably the most useful part of any of these articles, where it put it all together for me. It was a bit minute. My ADHD was going berserk reading these.
Yes.
But I was learning things. And it was like, oh, okay, now I see how these things come together. And I see how other games basically do this, but I don't know if I'd say better. Yeah, maybe better, but more specifically in a more streamlined way. So yeah, this isn't the only example mentioned. There are several throughout the entire book. We'll hasten to call it. It is a book eventually, so we'll just call it a book. And then we are down to armor, which in the order of these articles actually comes before infantry, at least in detail. So it was interesting that if you were to get the first issues of these articles, I wouldn't fault you for mistaking it for some kind of tank game. If you may have missed an issue where he talked about the existence of infantry. Armor, tanks, and other vehicles are represented by having a defensive power value, and this is measured against the penetrative value or strike value of the anti-tank weapon of another tank or a bazooka or similar weapon.
That's right. And this is unique because this is where you're actually going to be rolling 2d6 and adding them together instead of rolling 4 or 5, 6 or higher on a dice roll.
Yeah, this one uses a sort of averaging scale, and again, he does give a really good reasoning for the situation as it applies to including random and averaging to say that, you're more likely to hit this, and the average on 2d6 is 7. So any values are sort of up and down of that point. Knowing how 2d6 actually works mathematically, it does scale quite dramatically to the edges. But in a game like this, where there's no progression for units, it works out really well, which it's been used in tons of games following this.
He also does talk about armor tactics and a description of armor from the millimeter thickness of the plating.
Yeah, he gets very specific, going from a similar justification from the movement, speed, and distance, in the sense that he actually tracks down, determines what is the maximum thickness for each of these vehicles. The translation of that is a little more obtuse. I tried to do the math, and I found the numbers didn't always line up, but the ratios were more or less close. That's to say, the armor value versus the defensive value.
And then the strike value of the anti-tank weaponry or anti-tank guns is, as we said, a 2d6 attack roll versus the vehicle's defensive value, which is, just as we were indicating, extrapolated from that millimeters armor description.
As I understand it, it is the roll plus the strike value over the defensive value.
That's right.
If you roll, add the I guess it's the accuracy, I guess the roll is the accuracy, and then the power of the weapon determines that. And then if you hit it, then that determines whether you successfully struck the other vehicle. And then that is broken out into maximum effective ranges, which is heavily based on something that I see done very differently in some other games, which is sighting. So maybe, Troy, you can kind of go through the visibility aspects.
So this is really interesting because visibility is contextual. How it works is that players may have information that their tank commanders do not have. So the game actually discusses you playing with a hand tied behind your back in a certain capacity, in that you are not to act on information that the troops themselves would not have based on their own sighting ability. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I know that there's a visibility roll done at the beginning of your match. There's like a little table for this, and it determines what the full sight of any situation, I think up into including things like fog.
Yep, that's right. And it also includes aided sight, so with binoculars, for example.
Yeah, I think this is one of those examples where the game gets really specific, where I've seen more modern games that include sighting to make this a bit more abstract.
Yeah, this game tries to have a certain authenticity around the sharing of information that is hard to track in more of a skirmish feeling game, if you know what I'm trying to indicate.
Yeah.
I feel like this game gets concerned with things that are a higher level of command than what we're actually depicting on the table. And I think that keeps happening in this game, which is really interesting for a lot of players, including myself. But it's just a little bit out of touch with a platoon level game where everyone's kind of in vocal range of each other.
Yeah. There are some specificities that could be simplified within the area of spotting and visibility and communications.
Well, even in terms of spotting and visibility, another important part of it for armor, at least, is the angle of attack for tanks.
Yeah. Oh boy. This was kind of like, I was like, oh wow, that's neat. I'm never going to do that. But go ahead, Troy. Explain the intricacies of shooting at a tank.
Well, you're looking at the side of the tank, and you're going to use a protractor to help determine your strike angle. And this is going to modify your attack roll. So it's not super complicated of a process. It's just you're getting at a protractor and you're doing these minute measurements, and it's not very fast or fun. We'll call it that.
Yeah. So maybe the easy way to describe this verbally is there is a difference of armor depending on what side of the tank you're hitting. So either the front, the side, or the back. The front obviously being the most armored, the back being the least, and For anyone who understands why tanks are built that way, it's because you can only throw so much weight on it, so better to put it where you need it. And that is totally represented in other war games. But it then adds this other level of complexity, which I'm going to use geometry in the sense that it calculates the sheerness of the shot. So how perpendicular or oblique the angle is to that side. So if you run at a very, very sort of tight diagonal to say the side, it actually makes it more likely to skip off, which makes total sense. But it's not very fun.
That's exactly it.
Like for anyone who plays war games that have things like angle of attack on a vehicle, there are sometimes little sort of squidgy moments where you're like, is that hitting the front or the side? Okay, now you're adding another area of deliberation where you're like, okay, is that within like the sheerest point? Or is that like slightly, because there are, I guess, 3 degrees. Yeah, essentially 3 degrees. So there's either perpendicular, which is no negative modifier. Then there's, guess it's sort of in the 45-degree range. It's a little wider than that. That's -1. So you're kind of hitting the side at an angle. And yeah, I can see that. It could skip. And then there's a -2, which is like, oh, I don't know. That's like twice that, like 80 degrees or something like that. Not maybe like 70. Somewhere in that range where, yeah, if you thought about it from base principles, it probably would skip. But in practice, I don't want to do that.
I know.
I mean, maybe, but like if it was only tanks, sure. You know what? That actually probably would work. I don't have to think about anything else. But because it's a combined arms game, no.
I absolutely am with you. But it does give you another way to knock out tanks. There are anti-tank mines.
Ah, the mines. Yeah. Okay. Give us the mines.
So they indicate them on a map, and they are solely used for defensive purposes. They can be given, they're given rates for actually deploying them in battle, but it's almost like that's more for campaign or scenario usage, not for actual pick up and play games where you would never really have your 8 engineers stop to lay a strip of mines. You know, you wouldn't really do that in a game. But this title exclusively uses anti-tank mines. There are no anti-personnel, so infantry will not trigger them. And vehicles roll for destruction, immobilization, or no effect when they move through a mined area, which of course is hidden information unless it's marked physically on the miniature map. So once you conclude your, say, 6 inches of road movement into the mined area, after that you'll make a roll. And depending on the type of vehicle you are, soft-skinned, half-track, or tank will determine how likely it is you get blown to pieces.
When you're dealing with mines, there's this idea of secret information. How is that handled? Because in some cases, at least in the games that we play, mines are more or less placed as an obstacle that can be removed.
Yes. Mines can be cleared in this. It takes forever, but you can do it with your own Pioneer team. But this game doesn't work with a referee or a GM, unlike some other World War II titles. So the hidden information is between the players. So there are times where you'll have to have a map where you mark hidden troops or hidden mines. And the players use that as a way to adjudicate between themselves. But there is no referee or GM to help with that.
Yeah, there's no suggestion of that I saw. Even though that concept would exist. Certainly, again, Kriegspiel being a reference I made earlier.
Exactly.
It's not like, it's not unheard of, but there is this idea of a 2-person autonomous game being played. And then we have a short sample similar to the 2 farms scenario, but just for armor. It's a fair bit shorter, but it does kind of, it puts together these concepts and basically has a couple scout vehicles, a armor column, and then another group of tanks that are kind of coming to a point near 2 bridges. Was it 2 bridges? Or 1 bridge at least?
1 bridge.
Yeah. And there's I guess you could kind of describe it as a bottlenecking effect. And the lighter vehicles are picked off, and then it is also sort of left in an inconclusive way, but it does serve the purpose of explaining how the rules work in action. Then we can move on to artillery, which I think, Troy, you probably have more of the understanding of the expertise of this, but there are some funny things that I will mention.
The artillery, if this is your long-range guns, these are the big ones, the 25-pounders, the 88s firing in support roll. These are the big guns, and they allow you to both place them on table which is a bit silly, the author acknowledges, and says you might need to place them in your back garden if you are to accurately represent their ranges. But he also does give you allowance for putting them on the table, as he does state wargamers love to see their toys. So, that being an evergreen truth, sometimes you put the tanks or the guns on the table. When they're off table, it is a little peculiar. What are your thoughts on that, Max?
Oh, with the game within a game thing?
Yeah.
That is slightly, well, it's not even slightly suggested. In fact, there's even that photo where I was talking about his giant table. There's another thing that's represented in that picture, which I thought it was just an interesting way to plan out a scenario. Turns out it's actually part of the game itself. So in order to represent the artillery in an accurate way, and this is a very like straight ahead way of thinking about it. You know, there's no abstraction in that. I think that's, as much as there are abstractions, they're definitely, he's not thinking in those ways when he doesn't have to. And this is a really good example of that. So when you represent artillery off the table, you represent it on a map. Okay, the best way I can describe this is you have your play space. It's the table in the room. And in the ideal situation, or his way of representing it, on the back wall is a map that represents the area that includes the table and all of the area for quite a distance around the table that is not represented. And you basically position your artillery in abstraction on that map. And you can maneuver it in the same way, and you only need to represent it if that artillery actually moves into the area at the middle where the table is. So you're playing a game within a game.
You are. And where that artillery is positioned off map is even going to influence the dispersion of its blast markers when it fires, because you'll be considering, oh, this is from the southeast. Okay, so if it's firing from the southeast, that means it's going to be blasting this way. And it kind of gives you, I don't love this term, but it does give you a sense of immersion when you have a map and then you look at a table and there's a relationship between them. It's creating something bigger than just the game.
Yeah, I love the audacity of it. And I don't even think he thought it was audacious when he was like doing that. But it's like, yeah, so the normal thing to do is to play the game in two scales simultaneously, which, again, as you were saying, Troy, accounts for things like visibility and firing range onto the table. And I guess the idea is that the table is the focal point or the objective, because otherwise you're playing an SPI game without the hex grid, for a reference to that era of gaming as well. Otherwise, artillery functions kind of like any other vehicle with a ridiculous range, which is what it is. It also has to be established, as far as I understand.
Yep. And how you do that in part is, sorry for cutting you off, is through communications.
Yeah. So maybe you can kind of walk us through the procedure of deploying and using artillery.
So artillery, much like machine guns and some of the other aspects of the game, have to be stationary for the move so they can proceed with firing. How it works is you roll similarly to mortars to range a shot in, and then you roll for effect afterwards on an easier dice roll, on an easier target number. To be able to talk to your off-table artillery, you do need to use radio contact. So if your artillery battery is on table and within range of your HQ company, you can direct it normally. You know, it's an on-table asset that's under command. But if it's off-table, it'll take a 5+ on a D6 to establish radio contact from your wireless operator. And that's someone who's going to be with usually your HQ platoon or your company HQ, and they'll be able to start a connection on a 5+, and then on subsequent turns, maintain that connection on a 2+.
So it does get easier once you've established it, but having that feedback between communication and spotting is pretty much the only way to make it work.
You're right. And you do need to have the forward observer if the person is off table as well. So that's who's actually going to be spotting for them. If the guns are on table, they can even see their targets and shoot, over the sights, as it were. But when you are off table, you are relying on a forward observer.
And then artillery fire.
How artillery fire works is it's got the same, like we were saying, fire for mortars, but it effectively is in line with the tactical fire support that a battalion would get. So it's like a section of a battery as opposed to the whole thing. And you get 2 guns, and these use, as opposed to a circular template for the mortars, these use a rectangular directional blast template that's 1 inch by 3 inches that you place down. And there is 4+ for infantry casualties in the blast area, so very similar to how rifle shooting is handled with just a single D6 for effect. But if you hit a tank, half track, or a soft skin vehicle, you roll on a reference table for impact. Where I think the worst thing that can happen to a tank is you can blow the tread off, but a soft skin will just pop if it's caught under artillery.
I notice a lot of favoritism for the heavier tanks. Not to say that a strong artillery hit is not survivable, but yeah, this absolutely wrecks anything less than a heavy tank.
100% it does. And the 105 millimeter howitzer is kind of the standard of what the artillery is meant to represent.
Which is an odd choice if I think about it.
It's interesting. It's a bit specific, but that's what he goes with. And he talks about the 25 pounder of the Brits being like the venerable heavy gun, but unfortunately, at this time, no one made a model for it. So he kind of went another direction. So for me, I would have expected the 25 pounder. But no, it was the howitzer just because of model availability at the time.
Makes perfect sense. Like, there's no company out there making models for war games. So
it's like, yeah, you have such a smaller pool, that you can draw from, right? Like your manufacturers there's no equivalent Warlord Games who's just like, I make World War II models for gaming, for the table. Like Airfix models can be used for military modeling, for all types of things, right? So it's interesting that you have to work with what you've got. And he even talks about that for setting up the communication trucks. And he'll say, like, there isn't a great Jeep. So you take a length of wire and affix it to the back of the Jeep to create an aerial, and you've now created a radio truck. And he kind of goes about giving you these tips to get around the availability of certain models that we may take for granted today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's as much a guide to how to DIY a game without any kind of model support as you're probably going to get. I was kind of wondering, so for this scale of combat, Troy and I tend to favor 15 mil, which is, I guess, pretty close to HO scale for trains.
Yes.
I'm actually kind of curious because model trains have been a thing forever, but I don't know when HO scale became like a popular scale. That's just a thing off the top of my head, because I'm like, I don't think they had that many shorter figurines.
Yeah, that's true. That's a really good question.
Because I can see, like, especially with a lot of the miniatures that I have, the delicacy with some of those is, well, again, it really depends on the sculpt. But when I look at a lot of the older miniatures that I've seen, they don't appear to have the support for that level of delicacy. I feel like if you made a 15 millimeter model back then, it might look a bit lumpy. But I don't know. They had plastic, believe it or not.
That's so true. But yeah, that would be the description of how artillery is kind of handled. I should mention before we move on that the crews came in groups of 4 down to a minimum of 2 after sustaining casualties. And then after that, the gun was ineffective. So they talk about crewing and unlimbering a little bit with your crew requirements.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. Because I don't even know that games, like American games equivalent to this, like an Avalon Hill game or an SPI game, even has necessarily that idea of disability.
Right. The weapon is either on or off.
Yeah, and that's the easiest way to do it. I mean, it's some bookkeeping to measure a level of damage when you're dealing with that many units. But it was neat to see that, yeah, you can have a half-manned piece of artillery and it has an effect.
Exactly. It's something that leans back into that man-to-man element of this rule set, where the physical models on this table are guys and what they're doing is important, which it then kind of stresses against that the other way by including higher command level concerns. But the dudes on the table are still doing individual level actions. So when you manage to hit half an artillery crew, you hit half of them. It's not quite like, oh, the artillery gun's at 50% pips, but it still does everything normally. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It makes sense. And I think it's important to kind of understand that because of when this game was developed, I mean, if you described what you meant by man-to-man in that situation, I think you'd understand exactly what you meant. But I think that partitioning of those different scales as having different concerns is probably not a relevant thing. I think, again, he's going with the source material and kind of working up from there and smoothing over parts that might be too fiddly, but he is thinking about it down to the unit level, even though you can see why other games don't do that. You can see why those divisions between, oh, this is a skirmish game and this is a battlefield game. This one is somewhere in the middle. And in fact, in some cases is like a command game, if we're talking about that map on the wall.
Exactly. You're wearing many hats.
And now finally we can talk about the last few sections, which concern, I guess, mostly morale, but also some tactical concerns. We're not going through this in the order of the articles exactly, but we are kind of covering where these would show up. And there are some further points that come up. But yeah, right now it's the terrain and tactics that we'll look at next. So Troy, give me an overview of how morale functions in this game.
This game asserts that the force with higher morale will be the victor, not the force that shot more accurately or anything. It's if a smaller number of troops is confronted with a greater force, whether in arms or firepower or in numbers, if their morale is higher, they could still win. And this game has that built right in. And modern morale is different than what you might classically see in bigger battle games or in games where a bigger unit fought as one. So think about the Napoleonic era, where you're going to have battalions and brigades in sight of each other, shoulder the cloth to cloth. And what's going to happen is those units are going to be measured in morale as a whole. But in a more modern game where you're dispersing your forces due to firepower and ordnance and all these factors, you want to take morale down to a smaller group of troops. So what he talks about is you can't check morale at the battalion level. You have to go down to company level because each company will be acting in isolation of each other as a separate fighting force.
Yeah. Just for reference, in Napoleonics and even all the way up into like medieval warfare, morale is more tied to formation than it is necessarily to a more abstract factor about, I mean, it is willingness to push forward, but having formations broken because it's such close fighting is more of a measure of that. And so I think that's why it represents the way that it does. But as you say, splitting the forces in the way that World War II combat actually works, you can't really measure it like that. So maybe, yeah, let's go through the factors that are put in to give a realism or sense of this.
Yeah. There's a jaunty 4 C's of morale. The control, cover, communication, and casualties. And then it gets ruined by vehicle damage as applicable as the 5th point, so it loses its nice alliteration. But that would be what you're looking at. So first, control is, are you within control of your leader? So your immediate HQ. And that leads up to your platoon HQ, your company HQ, your battalion HQ. And as we discussed, the battalion and company HQ are kind of squished together. So in this, if you're within line of sight and active, or you have radio contact, you can be considered to be in control. If you're in light cover, you're considered neutral. Actually, let me rewind for a quick sec. You actually start at a base morale of 10. You must equal or exceed 10 on a D6 roll plus modifiers, starting at your value of 10. So it's assumed troops will pass morale, but then we start to apply these factors. So that's going to be, the control is either going to be a 0 if you are under control, or a -1 to your 10 if you are not in control. For cover, if you're in light cover, so that would be soft, trees, foliage, wooden buildings, that would mean you are at a natural 0. So you're staying at your 10. If you're in the open, you're at a -1 as that stresses the troops. But if you're in hard cover, it's a +1. So if you're within the stone farmhouse, you'll be a little more secure. Communication is where you have to maintain your communication with upper level command. Control is lower level command. So pardon me, let me clarify myself. So your control is your direct squad leader, while your communication is your sense of command up to the company or battalion level. So there is actually a distinction between someone being there to guide your hand and someone giving you overall instructions from the top.
Yeah, that's interesting because in other games, that higher level of command tends to only come into play in campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting that, it's just sort of like a given thing to calculate total morale.
It is. And then the last aspect are casualties and vehicle damage. If you've taken 25% casualties of your current troop number, so proportionate to the number of people there, that will trigger a morale rating or a morale check. And then the vehicle damage would be if you were in a transport that got knocked out. So if you're in a half track that gets hit with a Panzerfaust and you have to bail out, as happens so many times in the demonstrations in this game book, at that point, you'll be forced to make a morale check. And you cannot count the vehicle as cover for the purposes of this morale check. Though for future morale checks, if you're still lurking behind your smoking half-track, it will count as hardcover, but for the initial roll, because it's a flaming wreckage you're crawling out of, it does not give you any bonuses. It is, in fact, another -1 to your 10. And once you've calculated your factors, you'll then roll your d6, take a look, factor in your modifiers, and that will have your unit either pass or fail their morale check if they get under 10. So as you see, you do need to have a couple negative morale factors stacked against you before your troops are likely to start breaking, because if you have a base 10 and you roll a d6, at a minimum you'll pass it. So it does take some combat stress and wear and tear on the unit. It doesn't represent it in some of the more iconic ways, like Shock in other games, where there's an actual physical morale component you play with as the player. It's a little bit more just remembering what -1 to apply, but this is how you track the leadership of a squad and how cohesion applies. And by the way, this is like the last chapter of this game, and cohesion is for the first time mentioned, which is kind of hilarious to me, thinking of so many other squad games. Anyways, when it is mentioned, it's in relation to the leader. So that's a way that you can do leadership checks, is you need to be within a certain proximity to your leader, or you don't count as under control, as we discussed above. But this morale system, it's pretty basic. It's just 10 minus roll a d6. But it does a pretty good job of forcing troops to actually be more casualty aware, because once you hit 25% losses, it's going to trigger. And if you've already suffered an officer casualty or an NCO casualty, or if you are now out of command because you've gone around a wall from your leaders and you can't see them anymore, you might be in a little bit more of a stressful position. And it can cause delays of no movement after you fail a morale check. And if you have to change your leader, it's a delay of 2 turns as the replacement is organized.
Interesting. So how do you feel in comparison to like the way that battle psychology is handled in modern games? How does this feel to you?
The assumption in this game is that the components of your army will have morale, but your army itself does not have morale. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's more broadly represented, I think, is the idea that I got from it.
And what that does is it means there isn't I'll borrow the term from Too Fat Lardies, a force morale that can break. You, the player, still have ultimate authority on if your force remains a fighting force or not. There isn't a morale that governs if your troops will break contact. It's only these local groups. So will your companies stay in line, not the whole battalion? And we talk about how these companies fight in isolation. So it's relevant that they have their independent morales, but I still like the more modern concept that your overall force does have a sense of morale, because your battalion commander is aware of the condition of these 3 companies, or they should be, if things are going at least okay. If they're not, then you for sure are in trouble. But the battalion commander should be able to have a picture, and they might know, okay, this is a forced withdrawal. There's no way we can win this. And I like that being part of a game system, because it gives the player consequences and pressures, as opposed to them just being able to say, like, I'm just going to play till my forces are burger because I don't care. There's an actual limit that forces them to consider, no, if I risk this, it could cost me morale in such a way as to limit my whole like if A company gets smashed, B company and C company may have some reservations about pressing the attack. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I mean, that makes sense. But it's interesting that it's only represented kind of in that narrowly defined position, which is relevant to the table.
Yes, it does. Absolutely.
But as you say, it's not like the force morale in, say, Chain of Command, which in a way acts as a sort of victory point or overall morale. This is more effect driven, and you can keep driving at it. It kind of gets harder. It's mud in your wheels, but it's not, you can't, as you say, you can just keep going.
At least in this, when you have multiple morale fails, you are forced to fall back. So it has an involuntary movement, which I really like. So there is still quite a push and pull of the morale system. It's just still giving full command to the player general in such a way as I like when that command is challenged by the autonomy of the troops below, who will sometimes not just run blindly into the enemy.
Absolutely. We have a final scenario, as you kind of alluded to, which really just puts everything together.
It does. It is described as a motorized infantry battalion attacking some hidden troops in a prepared position. The key things are that hidden troop placement is all about how this battle proceeds. So having troops on a map, not deploying them in advance, having them deployed as the other troops pass their visibility. So you remember you roll that at the start of the game, and then you're just seeing what people can see based on their movement. So you don't have to roll spotting checks that you may be familiar with from other games as frequently, but you still do need to find these hidden troops, and that's a huge part of this reconnaissance and force battle report. And there's a lot of casualties. Like, people take a lot of losses, vehicles get knocked out all over the place, and it's very common for a vehicle transport to get too far ahead of its support, get knocked out, and then everyone inside has to test for casualty. So it's a classic World War II fight. There's machine guns, there's artillery in the form of mortars, and there's a tank duel between some Mark IVs and some Tu-34s. So pretty classic stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. The absolute final sections concern terrain, and they cover a lot of it is given to how you make it. We didn't spend too much time on this section. There are some points about how restrictive visibility is with terrain, and this concerns things like height and line of sight based on elevation, as well as the ability to cover or traverse areas like rivers, waterways. It kind of gets a bit into explaining roads again, but a lot of this section is covered by how to build the terrain and essentially how to put it together. So it's got a lot of little neat hacks for like making trees. I won't go into too much detail, but yeah, it's an interesting point. I think they even mention you can play it outside using actual grass.
Oh, that's crazy.
Though again, he points out that this is kind of novel. So that it's the last section is just like, yeah, if you don't have a table, you can play in the garden. Which, I mean, the sort of peculiarities of scale already being a thing. Yeah, sure, go for it. But yeah, that is essentially covers at least the broad strokes of this very venerable and unique for its time rule set. We can then move into our usual section of lore, which is it's World War II. Go read a book.
Yes. I might recommend Anthony Beevor's History of World War II, the Second World War. Released in 2012. That is a phenomenal history of the war. It gives a great perspective, and something that I would say is an excellent jumping off point to anyone who knows what they think the war was about, but wants some more information.
Absolutely. And if you want a more cinematic thing, there are countless World War II movies, depending on what faction or group that you might want to play. Evidently, a lot of these amazing examples didn't exist at the time, though there would have been some. However, we don't have like home video, or like that wouldn't have become a broadly accessed thing until later. So books would have been probably the closest thing that you could use as a reference. But hey, lots of World War II movies for us today, and they give a dramatic, if not semi-accurate, representation of things. But it really depends on why you're playing. And Charles Grant does a good job of recognizing that it is for both the historian and the game enthusiast.
And you can even use imaginations, with a hyphen in the middle there, to fight fictitious wars. So you can, as we indicated earlier, create countries based on historical tropes or otherwise, and have them fight using the available models, just perhaps converted or customized or painted in schemes that are appropriate to your own fiction. So that is something that is completely supported. It's a well-known tradition in wargaming. A lot of people do it more in the era of Enlightenment or the Napoleonic era, where they use these principalities and small states that they base their armies around. But it works for World War II as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are even jumping off points. What's that famous? I've even played out that scenario as a sort of, not specifically, but more as a, no, I think we actually did play a campaign that didn't last. Operation Unthinkable.
Oh.
Which is a hypothetical scenario dreamed up by Winston Churchill about the potential need to move on the Russians at the end of the war, which is it's a neat idea.
Yeah, that's definitely wargaming fodder.
Yeah, that's one of those sort of hypotheticals if you want a jumping off point. But you're right, you could just make up anything. It doesn't really matter.
And there's extensive reference throughout the book to the models available that you can use to make these different nations, whether they be, the Americans or the British or the Germans, the Russians, Japanese, Canadians, whoever it may be, as well as if you want to do an imagination, what you can do. And some of the conversions that he even makes on his troops really take them out of the realm of a specific historical reference and are more evocative of the forces of the war, less so being a one-to-one, point-to-point, this is who this man represents.
Yeah, absolutely. So, final thoughts. It's anachronistic in comparison to what we might have available to us today.
Yes.
But it does seem very playable, and I can imagine anybody looking at this would be inspired, because this whole notion of a board game without a board, and you get to use these cool, like you might be somebody who paints model planes for the fun of it, and it was very fun to have these articles sandwiched between strange Meccano designs and articles about Thunderbirds, Argo, marionette show.
100%.
And having to like skim through that, I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't the article. But yeah, no. And one thing that I really like about this is how inviting and extremely British, very friendly and inviting to like the idea. Like you feel like it's somebody's cool uncle telling you about this crazy idea that he had. And it's intriguing.
It is.
You're just like, oh wow, that's neat. And he sort of like, from the very ground up, it's like, oh yeah, this is how I would do it. And, it inspired a lot of people apparently. So there you go.
Yeah, it certainly did. It laid down a foundation that World War II games would follow closely for decades, but also sci-fi games, fantasy games, other titles would take some of these simple resolution systems for dicing and run with them. And if you feel like some of this feels like a company level sci-fi game with a big box budget name that you've heard of before in the 3rd edition, it's because this is a direct inspiration for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that'll do it for this episode. Thank you for listening and following along with this little historical anecdote. And next episode will be dedicated to the absolute horror classic role-playing game, Call of Cthulhu.
Personal favorite of mine.
So for all you Lovecraft heads out there, tune in and we will get into what that game is all about. All right, have a good one.